Hello there, and welcome to Lesson 7 of Cell Biology. This is going to be on diffusion and gas exchange. Before we begin, please make sure that you do have all the required tools, so your pen, pencil, ruler, and also make sure that you're in a quiet place so that you can try and focus as much as you can. So, we're going to start off with the do now, 8 questions as usual, so pause the video and get started on that, please. Perfect. So let's start off with number 1. Define term stem cell. So this is from the previous lesson. Stem cell is a unspecialized cell that has yet to be differentiated into a specific type of cell. So it's kind of like a blank slate. Okay. Number 2. State where embryonic stem cells are found. So these ones, embryonic stem cells, not adult stem cells, are found in the early stages of development in the embryo. So you could also put blastocyst, because that is a term that we used last time. Number 3, identify 2 tissues that provide adult stem cells. So there's many types of different tissue that will provide adult stem cells, and some of them are brain, bone marrow, blood, skeletal tissue, and liver tissue. Okay, so we're going to move on to the rest of the questions here. Right, so number 4 asks, to complete the sentence, somatic stem cells are what kind of potent? So this one's going to be pluripotent, which means that they can become a different type of specialized cell, but it does have a restriction on where it originates from. So that's kind of the answer to number 5. They do have the ability to become other cells, but they only can become the organ or the type of cells that they originate from. So brain to brain, muscle to muscle. Number 6, identify what a chimera is in Greek mythology. So this was a fire-breathing creature with the physical traits of a lion, a goat, and a dragon. Number 7, in therapeutic cloning, what happens to the DNA in this cell? So this one is kind of a lengthy process, but the gist of it, the embryo is given the same DNA as the patient, meaning that there's going to be no rejection, and the cells could be differentiated into nerve cells for paralyzed patients or insulin-producing cells for diabetics. So the bottom line is that the embryo is given the same DNA as the patient, because if you had different DNA from the patient, then there is a risk of white blood cells attacking those stem cells. Okay. And the last one, number 8. What is special about meristem tissue in plants? So meristem tissue is where you find the stem cells for plants, and this is where they could be differentiated into other things. Okay? So just make sure that you have all the correct answers down there, and we'll move on. All right, so today's lesson is going to be on diffusion, which might seem like review because you have learned about this before, but go through the lesson, see if there's anything that you may have missed or you may have forgotten, because we do go way more in depth about diffusion in this lesson here. So hopefully by the end of today, you'll be able to tell me what diffusion is, and also describe the features of the lungs, allowing for efficient gas exchange. All right, and I've told you in previous videos that if there's any link to YouTube videos, please take the time to watch them, because any bit of help will be beneficial for you. I can only do so much on PowerPoint slides. I try to put in animations where I can, but obviously these people on YouTube, they have a lot more time and a lot more effort goes into making the videos that they make. Okay. All right, so first things first, what is diffusion? So here's the first term here, and diffusion is essentially the net movement of atoms or molecules of a gas or liquid from a high concentration to a low concentration. So highlight that first bit right there. And we're going to define some key terms here. So first of all, most important thing about diffusion is that it only occurs in gas and liquids. All right, it doesn't happen anywhere else. And this is kind of self-explanatory, because if you think about solids, solids don't really take the shape of a container, right? They just kind of sit there. Whereas gas and liquids, if you put them into a cup, it will hold the shape of that cup. It will look like a cup. Okay. And the last bit that's really important is it moves from high concentration to low concentration. So if you've forgotten what those terms mean, look at the diagram below. High concentration would be on the left part of the diagram, all those little red molecules, right? that area would be high concentration. And everywhere else in the beaker where there's no red molecules would be low concentration. And after time, the arrow points that all those red molecules will kind of move to those places of low concentration. So that's diffusion, where atoms or molecules will move from high to low concentration. Okay, so there's a term here that you do need to know, and that is concentration gradient. All right, and concentration gradient is basically the difference in concentration. That's all it is, right? We want to shorten it down a little bit, and if you have high concentration gradient, then that means that the difference in concentration is very, very high, right? You have a very big difference, so you have a high concentration gradient. And then the opposite is also true. If you don't have a big difference, or if you have a very small difference in concentration, then you have what's called a low concentration gradient. Okay? And this will become important later on when we're talking about the rates of diffusion, so how fast diffusion can occur. Okay? And the last thing about diffusion that you need to know is that particles are not forced to move, right? It just happens on its own, and so there's no energy that's actually required in diffusion. So we call this a passive process, all right? Passive meaning there's nothing active about it, okay? But that being said, there is a type of diffusion, I should say, that requires energy, and that's called active transport. And we're gonna learn more about active transport in lesson 10. Okay, but the best example that I would have shown you in a classroom is getting a glass of water and putting food, some sort of food coloring dye. Okay, and what I would do is I would put it in the beginning and show you that you could clearly see that there are parts of the glass, or sorry, parts of the water that are red and parts of the water that are still clear, and I wouldn't stir it. I would just kind of leave it the way it is. And at the end of the lesson, you'll notice that the water turns red all throughout. There's no clear parts of the water. And that's kind of the magic of diffusion. Okay, without even touching it, it'll turn red. All right? Right. So that brings me to this part of diffusion in cells. So in living organisms, so in your own body, diffusion is the way in which chemicals move into and out of your cells. All right? So the most important organelle that we're going to talk about today is the cell membrane. And the cell membrane is basically, it's almost like the skin of the cell, in that it kind of controls or contains everything, but it also allows things to move in and outside. So let's just read the sentence right here. A cell membrane is described as being selectively or partially permeable because it controls and allows certain chemicals to pass through. So let's start off with the word permeable, okay? If something is permeable, that means that things can pass through it, all right? So, you think of like a piece of paper with a bunch of holes in it, right? Things can pass through it. In a cell, if something is permeable, then it does have holes in it, which allows things to go in and out of it. Now, things that are selectively or partially permeable kind of brings you to think about, certain things can go in and certain things can't. It's selective about what goes in. Now, the membrane doesn't have a brain that, thinks, oh, this goes in, this doesn't. But it does have basically a layer where things can go in and out. So in the diagram below, the cell membrane would be this part right here. And you notice that it's drawn by a dotted line, which means that there are holes in there that allows molecules to pass through, which is exactly what happens, right? On the left side of the diagram, you have two sides of the membrane, one having more molecules, and then on the right side, some of those molecules get transferred over to the right side through that membrane. Okay, now this doesn't really do you justice about what the membrane looks like, so I've added in a little animation to show you what it might look like. So the first thing that you should notice is the membrane is the orange parts right there, okay? And you have two different types of molecules. You have the small blue ones with the white tips, and you have the green molecules. And you should notice that the green molecules can't get through the membrane, where the small blue ones can. So this is actually a very common thing in your body where large molecules will not be able to pass through a membrane, where small ones do. So in this example, the small blue molecules are actually oxygen. Okay, so there are lots of examples substances that need to pass through a cell membrane, such as proteins, lipids, carbs, hormones, oxygen, and carbon dioxide. Okay. Okay. This next part here, I would have loved to do in the classroom as a demonstration, but I'll kind of explain it to you in words. So basically, what we would do is I would have an air freshener or a bottle of perfume, and I would spray it in one corner of the room. And I would ask you guys, if you could smell the perfume. And, you probably already know, but basically the people who are closest to the perfume will be able to smell it first, and the people farthest away may be able to get like a hint of the perfume, but, maybe not smell it as strongly as the people closest to it. So this is actually a perfect example of diffusion. And you can actually do this in your own home as well. You can spray air freshener in one corner of the room and then back away, and you'll start to smell it very, very faintly. Okay? So let's start off with the first question here. Why do we actually smell perfume? And the answer to that is because the perfume is still made up of particles. There's still molecules of that perfume. And when you spray it, it kind of goes airborne, and it's light enough to be carried around in the air. And what happens is those particles will eventually end up in your nose, and your nose has receptors that identify this is the smell, and then your brain can identify what that smell is. Okay, whether you have rose smell perfume or whatever perfume that you use, right? So who in the room could smell the perfume first? And I kind of explained this already, but generally the people or whoever is closest to wherever the perfume was sprayed first will be able to smell it first. Okay, and then the people in the back, say for example, will be able to smell it later. Now, if I were to ask you, how would you explain the intensity of the smell if you get someone from the front as opposed from someone from the back? You might say, well, the person in the back will probably smell it, but it won't be as strong as the person in person in the front smelled it, and you're exactly right. Okay, so the perfume, first of all, will diffuse to the low concentration areas of the room. So look at the animation right now, and the perfume starts off in close to part A, okay, or location A, and over time it will move to location B. But you'll notice that the concentration is the same all throughout the room, okay? And this is exactly because those perfume particles are moving to the low concentration areas of the room. Okay, and the reason why it smells less intense the further you are from the perfume is because you have less particles coming into your nose. So the best way I can explain this is if you spray the bottle of perfume right onto your nose, or if you spray it away from you, right? You'll still be able to smell it, but if you spray it right into your nose, you'll get the full blast of the smell. Whereas if you smell it, or sorry, if you spray it somewhere else, it'll be less intense. Okay. All right. So this one is actually another practical that I would have done, more of a demonstration, but it's very simple. You get a plate of M&Ms or Skittles, and you put them in a plate. And what you do then is you actually just pour in a bit of water that will coat the M&Ms or the Skittles, but not enough to make them float. And basically what happens is you'll notice a big wheel of colors. Okay, so the colors from the candy will actually move out into the water. And so there is a quick explanation for that. So just before you read that, I'll show you what it looks like if you leave it in the water for quite a long time. And again, you can do this at home. It's very, very simple. So the reason why this happens is the color of the M&Ms is diffusing towards the center of the dish, whereas there's less concentration. And this is because the color dye of the M&Ms is much more concentrated than the water. Okay, so the best way to explain this is if you drop a drop of food coloring into a glass of water. Okay, the first thing you're going to notice is that you can clearly identify what is water and what is colored, right? There are parts that are clear, there are parts that are blue or whatever color you put in. But over time, the dye or the color will move towards everywhere else in the water, and over time it will actually cover the entire water. And so if you put in blue food coloring, then the whole glass will turn blue after a while. Okay, so this is the same phenomenon that happens with Skittles as well. Okay, so each piece of candy has a really concentrated amount of color in it, or food coloring, and once you put it into water, then that food coloring is now able to get to other places that's not on the M&M. Okay, so again, you could do this one at home, and basically what happens is I show you what's happening in the animation right now. I put a drop of green coloring into a liquid, and you are to explain to me using the terms. Okay, they're all in bold there, and you don't feel like you have to use every single one because some of them are very similar to each other. Um, but using those terms, explain what's happening in the animation right now. Okay, so pause the video to go do that. Right. So you might have a different answer from me, but that's totally fine. But I'm going to show you what I wrote. So I wrote that when the drops of green liquid, or in this case you could say blue, are put into the water, the color slowly moves throughout the beaker. This is because the drops of green are very, very highly concentrated. So the green liquid, or I should say blue, the blue liquid will diffuse from high to low concentration. This will continue until the molecules of blue dye are equal throughout the whole beaker, and this is called equilibrium. So you may have heard this term equilibrium before, and if you didn't use it, that's completely fine. But basically, equilibrium is a state of where everything is equal. That's why the word equal is in there. So when you first put the drops of food dye in, then the beaker is not at equilibrium. You've upset the balance of concentration. But after time, the concentration of the food dye will be equal throughout the whole beaker. Okay? And once it gets to that point, then we call it equilibrium. So there's a balance of concentration. Okay? And equilibrium can not only be found in chemistry, but it can be found in all parts of life. Okay? Okay, at this point, if you want to take a quick break, go ahead and do that because I know this is quite a long lesson. But if you're good, let's keep moving on. All right, so this is a pretty big portion of the lesson, but I'm not going to have you read through the entire thing because it is quite long. So just follow along where I'm highlighting and make sure you make the same annotation. So I'll try to explain it as easiest as I can. Okay, so this area is called surface area and exchange. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about specific parts in your body, mainly your lungs. So let's start off at the beginning. In single cell organisms like bacteria or amoeba, the surface area to volume ratio is large as the surface encompasses the whole organism. Okay, so remember how I told you that this diffusion happens in your cells, right, in your body. Now, you are a multicellular organism, which means you have tons and billions of different cells in you, whereas these single cell organisms like bacteria, that's it, that's all they are. They're just one cell. And so they actually have a really, really large surface area to volume ratio because their whole entire body can diffuse, right? They can move in and out of their whole body. So for them, this is enough, this is sufficient for molecules to transport directly into and out of the organism. But for us, for humans, it's a little bit more complicated because we can't breathe through our skin. Okay? In multicellular organisms like us, it is much more difficult because we have a much smaller ratio. Right? Not enough substance can diffuse from the outer surface to supply the entire volume. So we have, like I said, billions of different types of cells. But in order to supply all these different cells, we have to breathe all the time. And sometimes the amount that we breathe in, not 100% of it is used up. So we're not as efficient as we can possibly be. Okay? So just underline that first section there where it says surface area to volume ratio. It's going to become important in a second. So to bypass this, I'm on line 7 now, this evolution has created exchange surfaces, all right, for efficient diffusion. So in our bodies, specifically our lungs, there's an area called exchange surface where we can diffuse a lot more better, okay? So our bodies have evolved so that we can breathe much better. And it gives you a bit more examples other than the lungs. Examples of the surfaces are kidney, lungs, and small intestines, and most of vertebrates. Fish, instead of having lungs, they will have gills. And then obviously in plants, their roots and their leaves have little holes on them to allow them to breathe much better. Okay, so let's continue on line 10. These exchange surfaces are specialized to allow for sufficient exchange by having a large surface area and a thin membrane. Okay, so underline that last bit there where it says large surface area and a thin membrane. So I'm going to explain the thin membrane first because that's a little bit self-explanatory. If you have let's say a cloth, yeah, a shirt, and your shirt is extremely thick, you might, if you get wet or if you're standing in the rain, it might take a little bit for your body to feel that that shirt is really wet, right? As opposed to if you have a really thin shirt and you stand out in the rain, you'll notice really quickly that your shirt is wet. Okay, so that explains the thin membrane because the thicker the membrane, the harder it is for things to get through that membrane. Okay. Now, surface area. A lot of students have problems understanding surface area because they don't know what surface area is to begin with. Okay, so let me just explain. This is a little bit of math. Okay, if you have some sort of cube or rectangular prism, all right, 3D shapes, the surface area is the area of everything on the surface, right? So in this diagram, if I took this rectangular prism and I cut it up so you can see every single bit, right? You'll notice that it looks something like this, okay, all spread out. So that's the surface area. Now, you can actually make it so that you can increase your surface area, and that is to basically cut things up, all right? So put it back into that cube shape again, and if you cut the cube in half, then you have two shapes that are quite similar. They're both rectangular prisms. What happens is your surface area, you just increase the surface area by cutting it out. Okay, and you might think, well, how does that happen? I still have the same shape, the area or the volume is still the same. But actually what you've done is you've increased the surface area because now you have more places where it is in contact with the air. Okay, so surface area of the cube on the left is 24 centimeters squared. Okay, because you have 2 by 2 squares and you have 6 of them. So 6 times the area of 1, you have 24. Now, if you cut up that cube so that you have 8 total pieces, right? Same volume, doesn't change, but you now have 8 pieces, each of them having an area of 1 by 1, and they're all cubes, right? So now you have, each cube has a surface area of 6, okay? But now you have 8 pieces, so your surface area actually just doubled by cutting it into 8 separate pieces. Okay, and you could do this more and more. The more you cut it up, the more surface area you have. But in your body, obviously, you're not cutting up things inside your body, but the cells will actually allow it to have all these different holes or more surface area for cells to diffuse in and out of. Okay, so different parts you can see this in your body. In the top left, this is part of your lungs. So your lungs have these things called air sacs, which are called alveoli. And when you breathe into your lungs, all that gas, all that oxygen is going into your lungs, and afterwards it'll actually get into your bloodstream. So your alveoli are wrapped in blood veins and arteries. And what happens is when you breathe out, carbon dioxide is being diffused into your lungs, where oxygen is being diffused into your bloodstream. And so this kind of exchange happens, right? A trade. I'll give you carbon dioxide if you give me oxygen, and vice versa. So your body needs oxygen to survive, and your body says, I have carbon dioxide, so here, take carbon dioxide, I'm going to take in oxygen. And you do this every time you take a breath. Okay. Another part that happens, diffusion happens in your body, is in your kidneys, right? So same concept, you have veins and arteries that go into your kidneys, and your kidneys will exchange things like urea for clean blood. So your kidneys are kind of like a filtering system. So it takes out the things that your body does not need, and then it takes into your bladder, right? But it also takes in water from your bloodstream as well. So anything that your bloodstream does not need, your kidneys are kind of like a garbage zone for that. Okay. Okay. Now that we've talked about what diffusion is, where you can see it in your body. Now it's going to talk about what affects diffusion. So we know that things can go faster or slower depending on the molecules that are present, things like that. But with diffusion, there's actually a really simple thing, or there's actually multiple simple things that affect how fast or how slow diffusion can happen. Okay, so let's start off in the first sentence here. The rate or speed at which diffusion occurs will be affected by a few factors. The temperature, so there's your first one. The temperature of the substance, as hotter objects will have more energy and therefore will move faster. So this one is actually quite simple. The hotter it is, the faster molecules will move. And you've learned this before, right? Hotter items have more kinetic energy. Same thing goes for molecules. Okay, let's move on. The surface area, which we can abbreviate to SA, the surface area of the membrane, as mentioned above, a large surface area to volume ratio will increase diffusion, whereas a small surface area to volume ratio will slow it down. So the best way I can explain this is if you have a room, okay, 4 walls, and you have a door on each wall, okay? That means you have 4 ways to go in and out of the room. Same with other people. They can enter the room in 4 different ways. Now, increasing the surface area might look like increasing the number of doors in the room. So now people will have, let's say, for example, 8 different ways to get into the room. You increase it even more. You put holes on the ceiling and the floor so that people can crawl in. Okay, so increasing the surface area basically means that there's more space for molecules to get in or out of the cell. Okay. Okay. Third one, the thickness of the membrane. Okay, the distance it has to travel will affect how fast it occurs. So same analogy. If you have a really, really thick shirt and you step outside into the rain, it might take a little bit of time for you to notice, oh, my shirt's wet. Okay. And if you had a really thin shirt, you step outside and the first drop hits your shirt and you say, oh, it's wet. Okay. So the thinner the membrane, the faster it will diffuse. Okay. And the last one, the concentration gradient. This is probably the most important one. Okay. Concentration gradient of the molecule. So if there is a very large number on one side, okay, if there's a very large number on one side and a small number on the other, then it has a high gradient. So the movement will be much faster. Okay, so I've put a little diagram because lots of students get confused on this one. I put a diagram on the bottom there. And the reason for that is because, it's easier to see it. So with the orange molecules, you'll notice that there's a very high concentration gradient. Okay? On the left side, there's lots of molecules. On the right side, there's not a lot. So if you have a big difference, right, then the concentration gradient is very high. And the high concentration gradient will increase the rate of diffusions or have a fast rate of diffusion. Now look at the bottom part. If you compare the left and the right side, there is a difference, but it's not as big of a difference as the first one. Okay, so what happens is you have a low concentration gradient, and that means that the rate of diffusion, how fast it diffuses out, right, will be much slow. The important thing to realize here is that in both of these scenarios, right, all the molecules will still move from a high concentration to a low concentration. The difference is in the speed. Okay, that's all that is. Okay. So why don't you go ahead and just highlight, I know I have you underline the 4 factors that we've just talked about, but what I've done is I've gone through and highlighted the bits that you need to highlight that will explain each 4 of those terms. Okay, so just remember, while you're highlighting this, I'm just going to talk through it. Just remember that on an assessment, if I ask you, what are 2 factors that affect diffusion, you can either say 2 of the 4, temperature, surface area, thickness of the membrane, or the concentration gradient. All right, and some of these might make more sense to you than others, but be sure to know all 4 of them and understand what it means for each one. Okay. All right, we're getting pretty close to the end of the lesson here, so that means we're going to finish off with a checkpoint and then the knowledge check. Right. So the checkpoint asks, explain how a large surface area to volume ratio maximizes gas exchange. So think about those terms that you just learned about, right? you know that surface area is one of the factors of the rate of diffusion. But how does increasing the surface area maximize gas exchange? So how does it make it more efficient? So go ahead and pause the video and figure that out really quickly. Perfect. So again, your answer might look differently from mine, but don't worry about that. So what I wrote is, if molecules are able to pass through a membrane, so if diffusion is even possible to begin with, then increasing the surface area will allow more gas to diffuse through. The more surface area, the more area there is for molecules to diffuse through, right? So this is where I use that door analogy, okay? You don't have to write the analogy down, but I figure if I write it down, it's easier for you to write that down instead of just listening to me. So I'll explain it really quickly one more time. Imagine you're in a room with 4 walls and there's a door on each wall. So that means that there's 4 ways to get in and out of the room. And to increase the surface area, that would mean increasing the amount of doors or the number of doors. So if I added an extra door on each wall, that means that there are now 8 possible ways to get in and out of the room. And then increasing even more, I might put more more doors, or I might put a door on the ceiling and the floor that will allow people to get in and out of the room much easier. Okay, so that's kind of what it's like to increase the surface area. There's more area for molecules to basically get in. All right. So that brings us to the knowledge check. We're going to answer the first 8 questions, and then we're going to finish off the 2. As always, the last questions that are out of the 8 are always kind of beyond thinking questions, okay? And we'll go through those together. So pause the video really quickly, and we'll go through them together. Perfect. So, number 1, let's define diffusion first. What is diffusion? It is the net movement of molecules from high concentration to low concentration. All right. Even if you don't have that word net there, that's fine. Net just means after everything, because diffusion doesn't always go from high to low. All right. Those molecules kind of like to move in random spots. It's not like they're controlled and say, oh, there's low area, low concentration, let's go over there. Right. There is always going to be those couple molecules that decide to move in a place where they want to move, right? And that might mean that they go from a low to high concentration, just out of randomness. But the majority of molecules will move from high to low concentration. Okay. Number 2, state 2 factors that affect diffusion. And number 3 actually says identify the other 2 factors. So remember, there was 4 total factors that we talked about that increase the speed or decrease the speed of diffusion. So there's the 4 right there: temperature, concentration gradient, surface area of the membrane, and thickness of the membrane. Okay, so there's your 4 right there. Number 4, suggest what states can move by diffusion. So this was in the definition in the very beginning. Diffusion only happens in gases and liquids. Okay, so there you go. Number 5, suggest what is meant by a concentration gradient. So going back to those definitions, make sure you understand what this is. A concentration gradient is the difference in concentration between 2 sides. So remember what it means to have a high concentration gradient and what is meant by a low concentration gradient, because those will help you understand and answer questions. Things like, if there's a low concentration gradient, then what is the rate of diffusion, right? Then you can tell me that it's slow. Number 6, in terms of diffusion, suggest what passive means. Okay, so we know that diffusion is a passive process, but what does that mean? Passive means that there is no energy involved, which means that when you put if you put some food coloring into a glass of water, you don't need to do anything. You don't need to add energy to it. All you need to do is just wait, and it will passively diffuse throughout the whole glass. Now, if you heated up the water, this will actually increase the speed of diffusion, right? Because you are actually adding in energy, not to the rate of diffusion, but actually to the water, which will speed it up. It's some really interesting stuff there. Number 7, State the two gases that are exchanged in the alveoli. So remember that alveoli are found in your lungs, and primarily there are two main gases that are, going back and forth inside your lungs. So that will be oxygen and carbon dioxide. Pretty simple there. Number 8. Suggest one adaptation of alveoli that enabled efficient gas exchange. So probably the most obvious one is that your alveoli over the years have evolved into having a large surface area. So if you go back to the actual paragraph where we talk about surface area, it will talk about how much surface area there actually is per alveoli. Right? So give that a read because I did gloss over it quite fast. All right, so the last two questions are a little bit extending, but number 9 asks, carbon dioxide is made by respiration in the cells. Explain why carbon dioxide moves from the cells into the bloodstream. Okay, and use the definition of diffusion to help you. So remember that in your cells you have the mitochondria, right? And these mitochondria use up oxygen in order to provide energy for your cells. But when they use up that oxygen, they give off carbon dioxide. So now they have to get rid of it because carbon dioxide, we can't really use that in our body, right? That's more for the plants. So then why does carbon dioxide move into the bloodstream? So carbon dioxide cannot be diffused out of our skin, right? Because our skin doesn't really secrete carbon dioxide. So the bloodstream is more of a transportation system. It carries them to our lungs where it is then exchanged for oxygen. They trade it in. The concentration of carbon dioxide is higher inside cells than the bloodstream, okay? Because the bloodstream mainly carries oxygen. So now you have a low concentration of CO2 or carbon dioxide in the bloodstream and a high concentration in the cell. So what does it do? It moves from high to low. So then it can diffuse into the lower area of the concentration. All right? So there you have it. And the last one, describe the ways in which the lungs are adapted for efficient gas exchange by diffusion. Sorry, I just went ahead and gave you the answer there, but the air sacs have a large surface area, so they are able to absorb more oxygen as well as dispel or disperse lots of carbon dioxide. So your lungs are actually really efficient in the way that we use up gas. But that's not to say that your lungs are perfect. Your lungs aren't 100% efficient, but you can increase the efficiency of it by exercising and making sure that your lungs are in really good working order, right? There are things that destroy alveoli, say for example, smoking. Okay, smoking is known to destroy the air sacs inside your lungs, which will obviously decrease the amount of oxygen you can get into your blood, which will destroy certain cells because they won't be able to get oxygen. So there are really, really vital organs in your body that require oxygen to function. One is your brain. So smoking will actually damage not only your lungs, but every aspect of your body, okay? And there you have it. So this was kind of a lengthy lesson on diffusion, but if there's any part that you missed, go back and revisit them. And as always, there's really good videos on YouTube that you can visit to maybe have a refresher on what diffusion is, okay? Thank you for watching.